We're recording this webinar and hope to put it up on a new YouTube channel fairly shortly. And I think that's all I need to say before actually starting my presentation. So I'm going to share my screen and run through my slide deck. So what is a conservation reserve? And here's a beautiful picture at Point Peter taken from actually the beach where the September 10th announcement was made. South Shore Joint Initiative is essentially a group of partners in conservation, and we're all focused on the county's South Shore, that is the South Shore Important Bird and Biodiversity Area. You can see on this slide the logos of the various organizations, which we consider to be partners or supporters of the South Shore Joint Initiative. APEC, Birds Canada, Hastings Preserved Land Trust, Kingston Field Naturalists, of course, the Prince Edward County Field Naturalists, Ontario Nature, Nature Canada, 20 Field Naturalists, and the Prince Edward Point Bird Observatory. This is our latest and greatest map showing the extent of protection and conservation on the South Shore. If you look at the purple outline here, this is the actual border, the official border of the South Shore Important Bird and Biodiversity Area. It includes both the land area and the waters surrounding. At the present time, we're indicating on here the various pieces which are protected, starting up at the top right hand here, Main Duck Island, which is part of national parks. Timber Island is part of a provincial park. Of course, the National Wildlife Area at Prince Edward Point, where the Bird Observatory is located. Ducks Unlimited Canada has a parcel I'm showing here with my cursor. The two green pieces on either side of the Ostrander Point Crown Land Block are owned by Nature Conservancy Canada. These are recent acquisitions, the Hudge and Rose Nature Reserve and the Maple Cross Coastline Reserve. Then there's a Miller property owned by the Hastings Prince Edward Land Trust. And down here, just outside the IBA, is NCC's latest acquisition, the Bass Family Nature Reserve. The two big orange pieces, that's what we're talking about tonight. The Ostrander Point Crown Land Block and Point Peter Provincial Wildlife Area, which the province is moving to turn into conservation area. So who are we? Somebody said we should put some pictures up of ourselves. I'm not sure that was such a good idea, but anyway, here we are. On the board of SSJI is myself. I'm in the top left-hand corner there. Amy Bodman, Chris Curry, Cheryl Anderson, Dick Bird, the famous Myrna Wood, and John Foster. And then the bottom two in the right-hand corner are folks who are really helping us with our communications and network organizing, Megan Miller and Dawn Eyre. So what have we been doing, or what are we up to? A lot of things. So supported recruitment, working with the network organizing concept that Nature Canada put to us. We've been doing a lot of recruitment of supporters. So over the last year, we've signed up at least 26 new volunteers. We have over 1,100 supporters in our database, and Nature Canada helped engage another 1,200 people who wrote letters in support of the Conservation Reserve designation back in the summer. In terms of outreach in the county, we have done presentations to municipal council, multiple local partners and groups. We have ongoing engagement with our MPP, Todd Smith, who have been tremendously supportive, our MP, Neil Ellis, and their office staffs. We are starting now to present a series of public Zoom webinars, and this is the first one. We also kind of set up a subgroup called the Hudge and House Restoration Subcommittee, which are fundraising and organizing to restore the Hudson house on the Hudson Rose Conservation Reserve. In terms of fundraising, we're shortly going to be setting up a fundraising campaign for SSJI. In terms of communications, we are on Facebook, we're on Instagram, doing lots of things about species at risk on social media. And John Foster has been putting out our roughly bi-monthly South Shoreliner e-newsletter, which is available by email. We have just published a booklet called Your Guide to the Prince Edward County South Shore IBA, with a first ever map and species at risk information guide. That is available to you now at all of the LCBOs in the county, a number of wineries, the libraries, a number of different stores. We're getting them out everywhere. And if you go to our website, you'll be able to find out where you can find copies. Well worth getting into. We will shortly be making available on social media 3 45-second roughly videos produced by Cherry Valley filmmaker Ryan Noth, highlighting the South Shore, bird banding, and Lake Ontario. And coming in of 2021 will be a campaign to nominate and recognize conservation champions of the county. All kinds of public events and activities going on. South Shore strolls are run almost monthly. Cheryl Anderson looks after that. We had an August event, the Flight of the Monarch. There was an open house at the Moses Hudson Log House in August. And there is a coloring contest on now. You can find all the details about these on the ssji.ca website. Tonight we're having the What is a Conservation Reserve webinar. In January, we'll be presenting an evening with Terry Sprague and Pamela Stagg. And we'll be participating in the county's Flashback February events featuring the Hudson House restoration with architect Edmund Rouse. And probably an online silent auction fundraiser. So that's what SSJI has been busy at for the last while. But enough of us. What you really came to hear this evening was Audrey Heagy. Audrey is the Community Council Coordinator for Ontario's St Williams Conservation Reserve. That reserve is down on just north of Lake Erie near Long Point. It was established in 2004. We think it may serve as a model for our South Shore Conservation Reserve. And Audrey's going to provide insights into developing a management plan for the Conservation Reserve to be a model for us. The St. Williams Community Council works with the Conservation Reserve Management Plan and the public, builds relationships with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry and MECP, the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Conservation reserves, you should know, are operated under the auspices of Conservation Parks or Parks Ontario. And in fact, we just received a letter back from the ministry today at SSJI agreeing to let us participate in the public consultation process and informing their efforts to define what are the distinctive values of our conservation reserve and to get going with that early in the new year. So without further ado, I'll unshare my screen here. And Audrey, if you've got your presentation ready, let you take it away.
Okay, that sounds good. I'll just share my screen. Okay, can people hear me and see the screen?
Can hear you. We're not seeing your screen.
Okay, I'll just.
Here it comes.
Okay, great, thanks. Skipped over one step there and it
Good.
can't do that. Okay.
Good. It looks great, Audrey. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks very much, John, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks very much for this opportunity to talk about one of my favorite places, the St. Williams Conservation Reserve. And tonight, I'll be sharing with you some information about the Conservation Reserve at St. Williams, and I'll talk a bit about its history and management of the Conservation Reserve. I'll keep it fairly high level, just to give you a sense of what's similar about the St. Williams Conservation Reserve in the South Shore, and there's quite a few differences as well about how the South Shore and the Crown Land situation there. And I'm hoping that this will answer some of your questions, and then in the Q&A after the talk, I'll be happy to try and answer additional questions you have on specific points. John mentioned that Ontario Parks will be leading the development of the management plan, and they'll be doing outreach and public consultations as part of that process, and they'll be the ones who will best be able to answer questions specifically about the South Shore Conservation Reserve, but this will at least give you a sense of what a conservation reserve is and then how it might apply, roll out in Prince Edward County. So where is the St. Williams Conservation Reserve? We're on southwest of Toronto, just north of Lake Erie by Long Point, Port Dover, in Norfolk County. We're about 2 hours driving from Toronto or an hour and a half from London. So we draw users from that entire area for day trips. And this is a close-up landscape view of the landscape and of the conservation reserves. There's 2 different tracts of land within the St. Williams Conservation Reserve, the Nursery tract and the Turkey Point tract. Landscape-wise, we're in an agricultural area. This is the big asparagus and tobacco growing area of Ontario and Canada, and a lot of market as well for other crops, as well as corn and beans as well. But also for southwestern Ontario, quite forested. We're about 25% forest cover, including deciduous woods and a lot of plantation areas. There's on the map, there's the bottom right corner is Turkey Point, one of the coastal wetlands. If you went farther south across Long Point Bay, here at the bottom of the screen is Long Point, so the biggest freshwater sand spit in the world. And yeah, in the Turkey Point tract, there's the Turkey Point Provincial Park is right across the road. And the other big forested tract here is Bacchus Woods, which is now owned and managed by the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Many of these other woodlots are Conservation Authority properties, and others are private lands. The total size of the Conservation Reserve is 1,034 hectares or 2,500 acres. And what is a conservation reserve? Well, the technical answer is that it's Crown land that is regulated under Ontario Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Act. So that one piece of legislation covers both how provincial parks are managed and also how conservation reserves are managed. Up until a couple of years ago, the provincial parks were managed by Ontario Parks. Conservation reserves were managed directly by Ministry of Natural Resources. And at that time, Ontario Parks was a part of the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry is what the name was at that time. But as John mentioned, this has changed as of April 2019. The conservation reserves and Ontario Parks were both moved to the newly expanded Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. The purpose of a conservation reserve, it's a protected area, so it's to protect significant natural and cultural features on Crown lands while maintaining opportunities for compatible traditional activities. Examples of those activities would include hunting or ATV use. It varies for the different conservation areas as to which uses were traditional activities and which are continued to permit, but it's quite a wide range across the province. So protected areas in Ontario, there's many types of protected areas and the definition varies, but there are federally protected areas such as national parks, national wildlife areas, national marine protected areas, total of 42 federally protected areas, totaling 1.3% of the province. Of that, about 1% is actually marine protected area within Lake Superior, so mostly the lake area there rather than land area. There's a lot more provincially protected areas, total of 653, and that's a category: provincial parks, conservation reserves, and other protected crown lands. That totals 9.4% of Ontario. These numbers are from an Ontario government website, and they exclude the actively logged part of Algonquin Provincial Park from that calculation. So sometimes you'll see a bit higher number there for the percent of protected areas. And then there's also privately protected conservation areas. I'm not sure exactly how the province is defining these at this time, but their number is 211 of these areas. I know they include some land trust properties or Nature Conservancy of Canada properties. I'm not sure if they also include some Ducks Unlimited properties or Conservation Authority properties. So but the total add up. There's quite a few of them, but they're all relatively small compared to Ontario. So the total amount of protected area in Ontario is 10.7%, which is a lot of acres, 28.5 million acres. But the stated target for amount of protected areas is supposed to have representation of all the features of Ontario within protected areas. So have a bit of each feature protected for the long term in a natural area. But it's also, there's a percentage number they've come up with, which is globally is 17% of land areas. So Ontario is well short of that target that's been put forward both by the province and federally. They've actually bumped it up from 17%. I think their goal could be as high as 30% of the country of Canada as a longer term goals. But the current protected area footprint is much smaller than the target area. So I expect to see the province and the federal governments announcing additional areas becoming protected lands over the next decade, hopefully sooner. So within the protected areas, going back to the map John showed, I think they're the orange colors on that map, had ones that were protected by the province. There's that 3 categories, 335 provincial parks. So you have some of those in the county. The total is 6.9% of Ontario protected within provincial parks. 295 conservation reserves in Ontario, so almost as many as provincial parks. Only 1.4% of the province, and they're much less well known in Southern Ontario because almost all the existing conservation reserves are in Northern Ontario. There's 3 in Southwestern Ontario, and I still haven't looked up to see how many are in Eastern Ontario, but it's still just a handful at most. So it's a term that most people in Southern Ontario aren't familiar with. There's many things to get confused with conservation areas and nature reserves. And those are different categories of protected areas. The conservation reserve specifically applies to those crown lands that are protected under the Provincial Parks and Conservation Reserves Acts. They've been regulated by the province as a conservation reserve. And how did the St Williams Conservation Reserve come into existence? So this photo is from 1908, showing part of what is now the Conservation Reserve. The history of Norfolk County has some overlap with Prince Edward County. Yeah, a long history of First Nation settlement, followed by the explorers, fur trade. There's a logging and lumber boom in the 1800s. There's influx of people following the War of 1812 in particular. And then the land surveying in the 1800s resulted in the land being parceled out. And at that point, it had been mostly logged and was getting turned over to agricultural, pasture, and croplands. Norfolk County is different from the Prince Edward County. We're on sand soils, out glacial sand soils, that when you expose them to wind, they dry out, they start to blow around. And by 1908, Norfolk County was known as a wasteland. And this led to the creation of the first forestry station in Ontario and Canada at St. Williams. This was the first experimental planting to try and stabilize the sand soils. They were planting pine trees. They were planting white pine trees initially. They actually were growing the trees in Germany. They send seed to Germany, grow the seedlings there, and then ship them back to Ontario to plant at St. Williams. They developed the forestry station so they could grow the trees locally, and that was the pattern that then got modeled at many other forestry stations, including the Kemptville station and also across Canada. So growing primarily coniferous seedlings, planting them in areas that had been denuded and were not suitable for agriculture, and then converting them into productive lands. This was the headquarters of the forestry station that operated 1908 to 1998, so 90 years of history. There, as part of the forestry station, they acquired additional lands surrounding the initial 100 acres they bought in 1908. Up until 1992 was the last parcel added to the conservation reserve, or to the forestry station lands. So that's how the Crown lands came into existence. Most of them had been privately owned at one point and then got sold off for back taxes at $5 an acre. 1998 was the Mike Harris government in Ontario, and privatization was the theme of that government, and the forestry stations were privatized. This is the greenhouse that was built at that time by the private company to grow tree seedlings rather than having them growing out in the open fields. They were growing in the nursery in containers for shipping around the province and around North America. But with the closing of the forestry station, it was now the private company running the tree nursery part. The resources was out of the picture, and the Crown lands that had been acquired over the years, which at that point was about 1,500 hectares of Crown lands near the forestry station and the two tracks. What the question came up now, what to do with those lands? They weren't needed by the Ministry of Natural Resources. The Ministry of Natural Resources didn't have a local presence for managing them. They were well used and well loved by the local community as public lands that had been freely accessible to them throughout the history of the forestry station. Getting people out into the forest was one of the programs that was organized through the forestry station, as well as demonstration plantations to show private landowners how they could planting trees could convert some of their marginal agricultural lands into productive forests. So 1998, the forestry station closed, and then there was a lot of public debates and open houses, and working groups formed to discuss what to do with the St. Williams Crown lands. And the end result of this was there had been some people wanted them protected as parks, some people wanted them left as they were, some people talked about developing them or privatizing them, but the end result of that 6-year consultation process was to regulate the lands as a provincial conservation reserve. So that formally happened in 2005, and then over the next 2 years, this management plan for the St. Williams Conservation Reserve was developed by the Ministry of Natural Resources with public input. And just to go back, why a conservation reserve for St. Williams? And that the thinking was that that was a good way to balance the different interests that applied to those crown lands. So they were ecologically significant with many rare and endangered species. There was a history of forestry research, so that a lot of there were several plantations were still being actively studied. There was a long-term carbon sequestration project underway. And there was a cultural heritage of this. The forestry station had been a major employer, and the other aspect of the cultural heritage is the public crown lands were well used and well loved by the local public. And there's a great diversity of recreational activities occurring on those lands. So a conservation reserve is seen as a way of balancing those different interests, give you a sense of the diversity of recreation happening at the conservation reserve. These are the traditional activities that were permitted to continue when the lands transferred from being a crown lands to being a conservation reserve. We have hunting, horseback riding, mountain bikes, snowmobiles, ATVs, dirt bikes, and then it's also a well-known naturalist spot, so bird watching, hiking, dog walking, cross-country skiing. Those activities all occur in the conservation reserve and have continued pretty well, yeah, since it became a conservation reserve. I'm going to throw in just a quick snapshot of what the conservation reserve looks like. It's quite different than the South Shore of Prince Edward County. The primary, oops, I think I skipped a key slide there too. Okay, so the management plan I mentioned was developed over a 2-year process. And this was the overarching goal set as a result of that process. And that was to determine that the future for these lands was that these tracts will be a flourishing example of extraordinary biological diversity, representing their pre-European settlement natural legacy of ecological communities, while protecting their unique cultural heritage and providing opportunities for compatible public land uses. So the goal is trying to keep everybody happy, protect the biological diversity, recognize the cultural heritage of these lands, and allow compatible public uses. So very much a balancing act established by that goal. And just the touch on the pre-European ecological diversity of this area was quite unique for Southern Ontario. Oak savanna woodlands with that were managed by First Nations using fire, had many rare and endangered plants such as the Virginia's goat rue. There's also habitats, sand barren habitats that some people would consider a wasteland are very ecologically significant. There's a number of species that depend on these dry open areas for survival, including hard-nosed stake, the native blue lupin, and this little guy is a katydid called the Davis's shieldback katydid that in Canada is only found in Norfolk, Canada, in Norfolk County in this type of dry habitat. But it's a diverse ecology as well. There are provincially significant wetlands present. There's hemlock ravines with cold water trout streams in them. And there's Carolinian forest that also supports many species at risk, including the eastern flowering dogwood, Norfolk County's on the coat of arms for Norfolk County. So that's a bit about the St. Williams Conservation Reserve. And then the other thing I'll talk about is how it's being managed today. And that comes back, the main point of that is to talk about the community council that's very involved in the management of the Conservation Reserve. And in 2006, when the Conservation Reserve was becoming established, the Ministry of Natural Resources was looking at a community-based management model, and this was based on the stewardship councils, which at that time were growing strong and working well for the Ministry of Natural Resources. So they envisioned setting up a community council for the conservation reserve, and they would communicate back and forth with the community council, and the community council would be their face in the community, interacting with the stakeholder groups, the recreational users, and the local landowners. That's the model they had in mind, and that came out during the public consultations for this conservation reserve. This model has not been used at any of the other conservation reserves in Ontario. And for the community council, they saw two roles. That communications role, the community council provides input and advice to the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, and would also communicate MNRF policy changes to the local community. But there's also an implementation role for the community council. From the beginning, there was no funding for conservation reserves, and the Ministry of Natural Resources, the Elmer District Office, was charged with managing the conservation reserve. They were an hour drive away from the conservation reserve. They were chronically in transition and downsizing, and just had very little capacity for managing the conservation reserve. So they were looking for a community delivery model where the community council would take a lead in implementing the management plan and operations plan for the conservation reserve. And that process of developing the community council took another 5 years or so, going back and forth between what responsibility, who could make what decision, how it was going to operate. That was all ongoing for many years. After 5 years, the community council felt that they weren't getting any traction. So at that point, they decided to incorporate as a nonprofit organization. Meant they were independent of Ministry of Natural Resources. The MNR couldn't dictate who was on the community council. They couldn't shut them down if there was a disagreement. So that independence was critical to getting the community council taking on more of an implementation role. They developed a MOU, a memorandum of understanding, that laid out the grounds of engagement between Ministry of Natural Resources and the community council. And the community council then started to actively implement the management plan with blessing from Ministry of Natural Resources, which was still charged with the management of the conservation reserve. The community council set up a pretty normal structure, board of directors with 6 to 12 volunteer members. They work collaboratively with the Ministry of Natural Resources Elmer District staff to set up an annual work plan. And they were tasked with raising the funds to do work in the conservation reserve, and they tapped into the species at risk funding because there are over 25 species at risk present in the conservation reserve, and there was provincial and federal funding available to improve habitat for those species. And that's how the community council worked with the Ministry of Natural Resources to manage the conservation reserve up until late 2018. We were just working on the second 10-year operating plan for the conservation reserve when it was announced that this transition of the conservation reserves to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation of Park, effective April 19th. And that kind of put everybody into limbo, though we were told it was going to be business as usual, and the community council should continue to operate as they had been in the past. And that is exactly what they did. They carried on. It wasn't until a year ago that the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks announced that it'd be Ontario Parks responsible for managing the St Williams Conservation Reserve, and specifically the superintendent of the Turkey Point Park cluster, which included Turkey Point Park, Long Point Park, Selkirk Park, so 3 very busy beach and campground oriented parks near the conservation reserve. He was getting another 2,500 acres of land added to his responsibilities. And so today, this is how the management structure is. Ontario Park Southwestern Zone Turkey Point Cluster is the designated managers for the Conservation Reserve. The Community Council has continued in its previous position as working closely with now Ontario Parks to deliver the management plan and operations for the Conservation Reserve. The Community Council works by hiring contractors. There's no employees. They use a mix of part-time contractors, including myself, to get the work done. So we typically each year we have a coordinator, a field operations crew, and an administration assistant have been in the same positions for several years, and we hire an ecologist, a forestry specialist, and prescribed burn specialist as needed. And then volunteers are also critical to getting work done in the Conservation Reserve. So we have them involved both as committee members and as stewardship volunteers. And I've probably covered most of this. The other important, so we're still raising funds from the species stewardship grants, but also revenue from forestry operations, because many of the plantations that have been established over the years at the Conservation Reserve lands are mature timber now. The goal is to restore them to native natural habitats, which requires removing the pine plantations, and we can generate revenue and keep those revenues for use at the Conservation Reserve. So the Community Council has built up both a reserve fund and a sustainability fund using those timber sale revenues. A lot of collaborations with local organizations, user groups, and researchers have been developed over the past 10 years. And the growing number of stewardship volunteers engaged in hands-on management of the property and of the trails. So just examples of some of the activities undertaken, focus on species at risk, habitat improvement, controlling invasive exotic plant species, surveying for species at risk before we do management activities, implementing managing activities such as prescribed burns and forest management. All this work has to be done consistent with environmental assessment screenings done by, now being done by Ontario Parks for us. And yeah, there's a lot of reporting and planning goes into these activities, but we're able to continue them year after year. Timber management we do in the wintertime. We have some operations underway now, and they're focused on converting the planted pines, some very nice red pine stands, which are super premium on those stands this winter, with the going for pressure treated wood, much in demand. But the goal here is to open up the canopy, get the sun down to the ground level, and get native plants seeding into those areas. We're starting to actively seed into areas where there's not good natural regeneration as well. Cultural heritage protection is something the Community Council, it's one of the management goals for the Conservation Reserve, but the Community Council hasn't taken a lead role in that. Up until this year, their local Heritage Association was operating the Forestry Interpretive Center, sharing the story of the forestry station, the 90-year legacy of tree planting and managing those trees to grow into healthy, productive forests. That they had headquartered in the old superintendent's headquarters for the forestry station, but that was part of the leased land, and that arrangement ended this year, unfortunately. So that public museum is no longer up and running. So still to be discussed how the Community Council will work with the Heritage Association to fill that void. But there are plans underway to look into doing more on that front. Trails and recreation management is also something the Community Council has been heavily engaged in. As M&R wasn't too involved in it, M&R developed the network of trails that they authorized. So people are allowed to walk wherever they want in the Conservation Reserve. There's no restriction on where you can walk. Hunting's allowed everywhere except there's a small buffer area around some of the fields, these open areas in the woods. In the right-hand side of the screen are part of the leased lands. They're still used for growing trees and plant materials. So they're not part of the conservation reserve, and the hunting buffer around these lands had been established when there was a forestry station to protect the workers out there in the fields in the hunting season. So the rest, there's pedestrians and hunters out can access any of the area. The red trails are designated as equestrian trails, so shared by pedestrians and horse riders. The yellow trails are multi-use trails, which can be used by motorized ATVs, dirt bikes, horses, and mountain bikes. This is the nursery track. At the Turkey Point track, there's also a network of mountain bike trails that established by a local mountain bike club, and it's connected to over 100 kilometers of mountain bike trails that cross over the provincial parks and some of the other conservation lands as well. The nursery track, there's a large area with no trails. That's where the provincially significant wetlands located. And this other area, there's in the center of the screen, that bare open area is a sand bearing area. You can probably see there's still ATV trails in there. That bare sand is created by unauthorized motorized use in there. So enforcement's still an ongoing issue, both in the wetland area and the sand bearing areas. But there is enforcement happening with the Ontario Parks and the conservation officers and Ontario Provincial Police all do enforcement activities in the conservation reserve. Yeah, volunteers are at the heart of the community council, both in the governance aspects, the committees, and the hands-on work, working with researchers, working with collaborators, doing outreach with, this is a high school group that was out helping with roadside garbage pickup. So couldn't do it without volunteers. Challenges that the community council has faced so far: working with government has been a challenge with high staff turnover. In the time we worked with Ministry of Natural Resources, at one point it was first 8 years we had 11 different contact people with them. The staff turnover was that high. There was 3 different district managers we were dealing with in 8-year period, and it got worse after that. But with the transfer to Ontario Parks in 2019, there was, yeah, we're going through a learning curve now. They have a different way of operating conservation reserve that's more bringing it in line with how they operate their provincial parks. So there's a, yeah, trust building and learning process ongoing with Ontario Parks currently. A major challenge is just trying to achieve that management goal of balancing the ecological integrity of the conservation reserve along with the diverse recreational uses. That's a, yeah, always getting challenged and always being trying to remedy and find solutions to when problems crop up on finding that balance of uses. Because demand here, we're close to so many urban centers, the demand for recreational activities, there's no user fee. There's not many places in Southern Ontario that currently allow ATVs or dirt bikes. So the demand for those uses in particular is going up, but horse riding trails aren't very many of them. And the mountain bike is a real growth industry down here. The local club has growing about 50% more members every year. They're probably around 600 members or more from a large area, and they're drawing people from Toronto and that type of range to come down here for a day use riding on their trails. And coordinating the restoration of the activities on the reserve is challenging because there's large area, limited funding, and what's the priority and how do you, what do you do first is a challenge. Successes, so the community council has grown greatly in its capacity to govern, both from a governance perspective and also just implementing the management plan. They've really become well established. in the last 5 years in particular. Education outreach, the community council developed a website, signage, social media, and organized events, displays at community fairs. So they are seen as the face of the conservation reserve in the public and with the user groups. Made good with the species at risk funding. We've made good progress in restoration operations with the logging, burns, and invasive plant control. Will be ongoing for many, many decades to get it back to the achieving that management goal of pre-European conditions and protecting the species at risk. But we have been able to achieve more in the last 10 years than was happening prior to that under Ministry of Natural Resources. Recreation management, ongoing challenge, but progress on that front. And the new relationship with Ontario Parks is going really well. They're based locally. The superintendent's right across the road from the Turkey Point track, and he's proximity and has the equipment available if we need it. And during the summer, he's got 80 staff. When the winter, they're down to 2.2 staff, but he has more. He still is quite available and accessible to help with the conservation reserve. They're getting out. They are taking more of a lead on putting up signage and doing enforcement now. As of just the last month, they've got park wardens are able to do park wardens in St. Williams Conservation Reserve only are allowed to do enforcement. Now that was new. So with a change from Ministry of Natural Resources to the transfer of the conservation reserves to Ontario Parks, the legislation had several aspects that had to be tweaked to make it easier to implement. So things like the park wardens being able to do enforcement. They can do enforcement in provincial parks, but the legislation had to get changed to allow them to do enforcement in the conservation reserves. The latest, that omnibus bill from the province has additional changes that would allow them to do things like charge user fee for events in the conservation reserve. Currently under the provincial parks and conservation reserves legislation, there is no way of charging user fees in conservation reserves. That's being changed. And that kind of gives a quick, hopefully fairly quick overview of how the St. Williams Conservation Reserve got up and running and how it's currently operating. I'll point out that it's the only conservation reserve in Ontario that has this situation. It's kind of combination of factors that led to it going this route. It's worked quite well. Took a while to get going, but it's been working well. And it's something that you might find as a useful model for the South Shore Conservation Reserve, given that you've got a strong local community group already up and running. So I'll shut up at this point. I'll be happy to answer questions later.
We actually had a few questions in the chat box for you, Audrey.
Okay.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. All right. So we have you managed to keep everyone happy? All the traditional uses pre-conservation reserve?
No, we've tried. We did a survey of users in the conservation reserve, just a non-scientific survey using SurveyMonkey online survey. And we had over 700 responses, and I think we had 84%, I think was the number, were said their experience in the conservation reserve was good or great. So not everybody. There was a small, but small number of the people who responded indicated their experience was not good. So, and that went across the board we looked at what type of user group. So.
So it wasn't a specific group?
No, wasn't. Yeah, there's a small number of negative responses from all the different users. A large proportion of the favorable ones were from active users, who motorized ATV snowmobile groups. Particularly, got the word out to their membership that to put in a favorable word that their experience was good, because and the mountain bike club as well. So those user groups keep asking for more trails or more exceptions, and always feel threatened that they're going to lose their privileges because there are bad actors out there causing the compliance problems in some of the sensitive habitats. So they realize that they have few choices now and they don't want to lose those. So they do try and police their own members, but many of the users are not members of any official club.
Awesome. Another question regarding traditional uses. Have the traditional uses of mountain bikes, hunting, horseback riding, etc., grown, diminished, or stayed the same over the years?
So I can speak. Mountain bike has definitely grown. It was not really a recognized use at the time the conservation reserve was developed in 2005 versus now. It's very active user group. They're the only user group that has an agreement with Ontario Parks that they actually maintain and manage their own trail system. It's a locally led, very influential group of people spearheading that organization. And yeah, and so they've grown from, they weren't in existence in 2005, and now they have over 600 members. The other uses, the ATV and dirt bike, probably it goes up and down a bit. It had been with gas prices. I noticed that was the only thing that kind of knocked back some points. So it's not, I don't think it's growing. We have a very small number of trails, so there's not a big draw compared to, say, Northumberland Forest or other areas of Eastern Ontario where there's a lot more trails for them to explore. We only have 20 odd kilometers of trails, so it's not the greatest experience if you're driving from, but people do drive 2 hours to, I mean, right here, the same trail over and over again. So it's been stable. And equestrian's still quite small, a number of users, so probably stable as well. And then the other user groups, hunting and naturalists, are probably stable. There's no indication that they've gone down in use, but they haven't gone up a whole lot either.
Awesome. Another question that was asked. It's interesting that St. Williams has 2 parts to its conservation reserve in terms of locations, just as the South Shore Conservation Reserve will also have 2 parts. Any comments with respect to managing the 2 parts of what is considered a single conservation reserve?
Yeah, I think because they were always managers, they were both part of the same forestry station, so they've always been managed as Unit 1 and Unit 2. So yeah, that hasn't cropped up. As at one point we did have some differences in how the trails were used at one track versus others. Kind of an experiment to see which of the users got along with each other on the multi-use trails. But we have changed it so that difference no longer exists. So they are managed quite, yeah, basically the same type of management occurs at both sites, and the same problems occur at both sites. They're about 10 kilometers apart, so not very far apart.
Can you tell us how you informed local people about what a conservation reserve is and how it may or may not allow their historic uses? Must have been a few questions from people new to those official designations.
Yeah, and I actually wasn't around during the 1998 to 2006 period. I got involved with the around 2007. I got involved with the community council, but so there had been a lot of public consultations and input led by the Ministry of Natural Resources prior to that designation. And then the management plan development again was, they put out proposals and got feedback. They did open houses, and then they developed this management plan using, yeah, and Ontario Parks will probably do something quite similar using their management plan framework. They have management plans for all the parks and all the conservation reserves, so you can go on their website and look at examples of what they put in there, but they're all a lot of similarities. At the higher level, that, you know, ecological integrity is the overriding priority, and then recreational activity will be in their education, research, and cultural heritage will also be included to varying degrees depending on the properties they're dealing with. And I'm losing track of the question now. I don't think I got all the way there to answering it.
It's okay. Did you want me to go over it again, or?
Your choice.
Okay. Yeah. Just I guess since you weren't around for when it was actually created, you might not know.
Okay, I can get back to once it was a conservation reserve and the management plan was in place, then the community council did a number of open houses for the public. It would kind of do one a year, just as have the community council there and Ministry of Natural Resources to answer questions at the time. Didn't do a whole lot of presentations other than that, and at the time we weren't doing displays, so it's more getting people to come down and ask questions face to face was what was done at the time. And usually whatever user group felt threatened at the time or had a particular request would be the group that showed up.
And are there issues around parking and waste management?
Yes. So parking's so the situation, the layout of the properties is they have roads, municipal roads bordering them, passing through them, and then with so there's roadside parking access points, and then the trail network was set up with something like 26 trailheads. So, and most of those you can just park right beside and access the trails that way. There weren't any really official parking areas prior to that. Prior to the CR, there's now 2 what we call parking areas, which are basically open sand areas that we also use for landings during the logging operation. So a lot of people park on the roadside. And the garbage dumping is just the chronic issue you have in any natural area, wooded area, on a remote road. We get dumping of household waste and garden waste along the roadsides. We do cleanups every year, and occasionally we do the first several years we had to do major cleanups, taking out, large stake trucks with freezers and fridges and beds and couches and all that. We have done some with dumpsters more recently, but it was mostly just small water bottle litter that's happening and some hazardous waste dumping.
Someone's asked, what is your budget?
The budget for the community council is based on our species restoration plans, and so it's currently about around 200,000 a year for this current year. It has fluctuated depending on what grants we have. If there's an endless amount of work that can be done, so if we can tap into extra resources, which happened this year through the federal government, this is a priority place with Environment Canada. So there was additional funding, so we just came up with just last month they said, can you spend more money and what on activities related to what their work plan was, and we said yes. So we're doing additional removing young pine plantations to create open land. So that bumped up our budget this year, but it's been 150 to 200,000 a year.
And someone's wondering what sort of income you get from the timber harvesting. You seem to be doing a lot more than most local groups.
Yeah, it's unusual for Ontario Parks, doesn't really deal with this either, but just because of the history of this particular site, the plantations were managed up until 1998, so they're really high quality red pine in some areas and white pine in others. We do timber sales where you put it out to tender. The amount of raised varies. Some years we have one bidder and it's like $18,000 because that was more larch, which isn't a big demand for, but the red pine, if it's hydropole quality, we can get over $100,000 on a timber sale. And that money is to be used in the reserve, but mostly that's going in the rainy day fund currently.
And going back to the recreational activities, do you have percentages of the different recreational activities, and how is hunting managed at the same time as other recreational uses like hiking during the hunting season?
Yeah, so that's a good question right now because today was the opening day for the December deer hunt for the shotgun season. And so Norfolk County, there's a lot of public lands that are accessible for public use at all times, and there's hunting on them at all times. So it's more as a user beware, we do our brochures and trail information say, be aware that hunting can be occurring at any time of the year in the conservation reserve. Yeah, so there's always a bit of, so the locals know when the hunting seasons are. People from away don't necessarily know until they see all the orange jacket and hat in the woods. It's also a big turkey hunting area in spring, in particular in April, May, when the birding season is on. So another question was about pedestrian use. How is it managed?
Sorry, I'm just... Yeah, how is hunting managed at the same time as pedestrian use, like hiking during the season?
Yeah. So we're just the trail brochure and the websites give notification that hunting could be happening, but it's we don't do any outreach around the hunting seasons currently. So yeah.
And what protection or understanding do you have to protect from the province making an alternative relationship and cutting the community council out of the equation?
We have no protection. We have currently the community councils, the agreement they have was the one with the Ministry of Natural Resources had just been carried on with Ontario Park, so it hasn't been updated or changed at all, other than changing the names of who from the government was responsible. And yes, so that's still a possibility. No indications that would happen, but but our ability to do any of the hands-on implementation activities is at the discretion of the Ontario Parks. The actual community council, it's the whole objectives of that organization when it incorporated were totally linked to what was in the management plan. So the community council has stayed very focused on its mission of managing the conservation reserve.
And are the night sky ambient light levels low, and has a dark sky site being considered in your location?
Yeah, so there are some local astronomers, and it's not a designated dark sky area, and we're down here. There has been some talk of it. We have a number of greenhouses for different uses, particularly currently it's marijuana growing and that's requires lights at night for the 12-hour grow cycle. So there is light pollution from that source is increasingly noticeable. But it's a good point. It'd be great. The Long Point itself is a wonderful night sky location, though you can see the ring of lights around the Lake Erie shorelines and the flashing lights from the wind turbines around Lake Erie shorelines. actual went, you can get out on Long Point. It's great for stargazing. But unfortunately, yeah, Norfolk County hasn't made any moves to try and reduce light pollution locally. I see that is happening in, I think Essex County has been requiring, I think, there's some talk at least of reducing the light pollution from greenhouses in particular as a major source there. There are mitigation measures that can be implemented. So hopefully Norfolk County will pick up on that as well.
And going back to your relationship with the province, does the council have a contract with the province and a term?
This, for any funding, there's always agreements with that are like 1 to 3 year terms on those. The memorandum of understanding with the currently Ontario Parks, I believe it was a 10-year term. So it's going to come up within the next couple of years for renewal. The environmental assessments need to be reviewed every 5 years currently. And we have an annual work plan that we haven't actually gone through that process with Ontario Parks, but with Ministry of Natural Resources, we would submit we generally just did a presentation to their advisory council saying, here's what we plan to do. And if there was no objections, we went ahead. That's how we operated there.
And this might be a question for John or Audrey, since you've gone through this experience, but what will our conservation reserve be called? Someone hopes that the name will not restrict the use of the name South Shore to apply only to the IBA.
Yeah, good question. We have no idea yet. I get the impression when you look at the names of the various conservation reserves in Ontario that they're never named after people, so that's probably out. And I think we would advocate for something to do with South Shore in a name.
Yeah, one thing I'll mention is one thing that's come up with the St. Williams is the 2 tracks were referred to in the regulations as Nursery Tract and Turkey Point Tract. And that was kind of how M&R had been referring to them earlier. And then the Heritage Association tried to rebrand them as the Zavitz Forest and White Forest after the 2 of the men that were instrumental in creating the forestry station. And the community council supported that. So we were using hybrid names for a while, but because of the once the names are regulated, it requires a change the Management Act and government process to change them. So for enforcement purposes, Ontario Parks is insisting that for now they have to continue with the names as in the regulation. So anyways, so figuring out the names sooner rather than later is a good idea.
And I think
That's
it for the question.
Thanks, Megan, for managing the question and answer period. And thank you, Audrey, for a marvelous presentation. This is kind of the second time that I've got to hear from you, and I hope that everybody has learned an awful lot. I know here at SSJI, we certainly have. I thought one of the interesting questions, and I just would like to address a little bit, is there is no guarantee that this community council can continue. You have, memorandum of understanding and sort of 10-year plans and so on, but it literally is at the whim of the government to change things. I would suggest, however, that what your community council is doing and what I could see happening here in the county is the kind of work that the government wouldn't be interested in doing anyway. So chances are they would welcome the opportunity to have a volunteer organization looking after arrangements in the same way that you folks have at St. Williams. Our understanding is that we will come under the stewardship of Sandbanks Provincial Park. So the superintendent of Sandbanks will be the official responsible for our conservation reserve. they're pretty busy on any given day just managing sandbanks, never mind interfering in what might, happen on the South Shore. So I'm hopeful that we'd be able to come up with, in the process of consultation with the government over the next number of months, with an arrangement that is something similar to the St. Williams Community Council. So yeah, fantastic presentation. I see there's additional comments. Folks are still chatting away, and by all means continue to do that. Anyone have any additional questions? You can always get to the SSJI.ca website and find ways to contact us and put questions together. And again, I would hope that we can get lots of people involved in the consultation process going forward for our new conservation reserve. So I'm going to share my screen again and go over the last couple of slides. Maybe. Oops. Try that again. So we believe we have 41 or more reasons why we are advocating for the South Shore, and this number keeps going up. We got 41 species at risk, which have habitat in either Ostrander Point Cloudland Block or Point Peter, and they're listed here. This information is contained in, and you can see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, the Guide to Prince Edward County South Shore Important Bird and Biodiversity Area, which, as I mentioned before, can be picked up all around the county at numerous locations, again, which will soon be listed on the website. What we're really doing is working to ensure with our partners that existing wildlife policies and legislation are addressed, to engage people in the South Shore with nature and recreational activities, make a significant contribution to Ontario's terrestrial and marine diversity protection, and help mitigate climate change by protecting important natural habitat. And finally, 9 ways that you can get involved if you are interested. And again, all of this can be seen on the website. As I mentioned, hopefully folks will take part in the 2021 public consultations on Conservation Reserve. You're going to find that I think many of the same issues that they have faced in St. Williams will be the case here. And we'll have to deal with that and work with the province to determine what is allowed and what is not allowed, and what will be the authorized trails and so on in our conservation reserve. You can get that county guide that I mentioned. You can attend a South Shore stroll that Cheryl Anderson is organizing virtually every month. Enter the Hudge and Rose coloring contest, information on the website. Ask about volunteer opportunities. Look at our frequently asked questions, which we will keep adding to on the website. Encourage others to advocate for the South Shore, and follow, like, comment, or share our Facebook and Instagram posts. We really have found over the last year that mounting this social media campaign and getting, I think we've had at least 22 articles or reports in local media, like the Gazette and the County Weekly News and the Wellington Times, has really raised the consciousness of the county to the South Shore Joint Initiative. And this is nothing, of course, but good. And with this victory now in moving along towards creating a conservation reserve, we have nothing but more wonderful things to come. So thank you, everybody, for attending this webinar this evening. I hope it lived up to your expectations. I did count 54 participants as a total at one point. That's pretty good. And we'll be in touch. Thank you all so much.